right. I am going live for a little bit tonight. Hopefully, the sound is coming in nice and clean because you notice a new microphone here. I was shooting some videos for my online ethics for artists and designers class using the new mic, and I thought maybe I'll go on and shoot some or do some live feed stuff right now. So it looks like we've got a few people in here already. Some people are rather excited. I just managed to get the postings up very quickly. So let me tell you about the microphone, and then I'll answer some questions or look at comments and stuff like that. You'll notice that if you've seen in my other videos, I used to use this blue snowball, and that has been crapping out to the point where I couldn't get consistent sound out of it, and it was echoing and doing weird stuff, and then a buzz involved. So, I talked to my wife, and I was like, "Listen, we got to get a new microphone." So we did a little bit of research and settled on this same blue company, but a better, closer to professional standards Yeti, which looks like it'll be kind of nice. So I don't have anything particularly planned for this, but I just wanted to try it out. I'm still playing around with settings. It's got more possible settings than just the 3 in the back that this thing had. So let me take a look at what we've got here in the hopper as far as questions. I have to click a few to actually let them get shown. Caesar asks, "What's my favorite piece of literature in philosophy?" And I guess you could say that philosophy, if we're understanding literature in the broad sense, that philosophy is a kind of literature, right? At least written philosophy. I don't know, I mean, the Platonic dialogues are really quite great, and there are other people who wrote dialogues as well, like Anselm of Canterbury's dialogues are really good. Augustine's are pretty good as well. I kind of like them. Hume is somebody who I think people know in part for his dialogues on natural religion. And there are quite a few people who wrote dialogues, many of which we've lost. So the dialogue form is kind of a cool way of doing things when it's not just using the dialogue to essentially be a monologue. Even Plato falls into that every once in a while, where it's just Glaucon saying, "Yes, Socrates, so brilliant, Socrates. I understand, Socrates." But when there's actual clashes between them, then it's quite good. And philosophical literature, whether it's Dostoevsky, who was a master at this, I think the book that he's best in with that is The Possessed or The Demons, depending on how you translate it. But Brothers Karamazov is great for that as well, and even The Idiot. Or think about the stories of Philip K. Dick, or somebody who I read recently, R. Scott Bakker. They're taking philosophical ideas and putting them into dialogue form. And what's cool about dialogues is that if the characters matter, the characters in some way exemplify or show what the positions that they're taking actually amount to. All right, so let me see what else we got here. Henry asks, "Do I have plans to expand the Kierkegaard series? I've read through a number of his works, and I feel like I've barely scratched the surface." Well, I don't have a Kierkegaard series. I was doing Kierkegaard as part of the existentialism series, which I will, I guess, down the line start up again once I'm not quite so busy. That was hour-long lectures. And yeah, I'd like to do Sickness Unto Death, definitely, and probably Repetition. I don't know if I want to do either or, because that's such a big book. And there's other things too. Works of Love is worth checking out. But I'll probably get into it eventually. Anthony Fickery asked, "Do you have any thoughts on Jean-Luc Marion?" Yeah, I've actually met him, and when I did meet him, he was kind of a jerk. He came down to Southern Illinois University And because Tony Steinbach was there, who I did my master's thesis under, and Steinbach is a big phenomenology guy, although he's really somebody whose star crested very early and is kind of went into decline after that. But kind of a name as a Husserl scholar, and Marion is interested in Husserl as well. And so Marion came, and I was sort of working on my dissertation at the time, but I got invited to go to like his talk and lunch with him and all that. And I spoke French, and I was in that weird sort of what's your status thing between like being a graduate student and being a professor. So they seated me close to him. As a matter of fact, I was sitting right next to him because he didn't want to talk English much. He just wanted to talk French. And so, we were talking back and forth, and all these poor graduate students were sitting around at this expensive restaurant. And after a while, I was like, they're here to ask you questions. That they didn't go here just to have lunch. And I don't remember exactly what he said. And I was like, do you think you could answer some of their questions? And he said something along the lines of, if they were important, I would. And for me, there was that. And then of course I asked him where in France he was from, and he looked at me like I was an idiot. And he was like, Paris, where else? And I was like, that whole, there's this whole like Paris versus everybody else thing in France. And I'm kind of hip to that. And, it's sort of like with us in America with New Yorkers or Washington, D.C., and so he did not, in the way he conducted himself, really live up to all this talk about charity and the other and all that. I've been told that he's behaved differently, in more recent times, but, I kind of think that you walk the walk if you're going to talk the talk. So if you're going to make charity, your absolutely central concept, you better exemplify that when you're dealing with people who are in a lower power position than you. So that's those are my thoughts on Jean-Luc Marion. I also interacted with him when he was doing stuff with the Lumen Christi Institute, and I was still living in the Chicagoland area. So, all right, let's see here. Tony Muther, do you think Derrida's hauntology is masturbatory? I guess if we mean by masturbatory that there's a lot of, sort of playing with yourself and not engaging, Derrida engages a lot of other thinkers, but he does so in a way that sort of, it's all centered around what Derrida is interested in. You don't get the sense in a lot of his writings, with the exception of the early stuff and some of the later stuff, but you don't get the sense that he's really trying to understand, say, Descartes on Descartes' own grounds or something like that. And you can do that and still think somebody's wrong. Somebody who I'd say is really good at that is Alistair MacIntyre. So you can do this sort of engaged critique of a thinker that's not just playing around with them and showing how clever you are. And Derrida sometimes has really great things to say, but a lot of what he is doing is just sort of cleverness. And I think, again, I'll tell you another story about my graduate school. So I was at a conference. It was actually at SPEP, the Society for Phenomenological and Existential Philosophy. And I had actually thought about doing my dissertation on Derrida. And I was there with my friend Phil Dean, and he introduced me to a friend of his from, I don't know, some place out east, like Yale or something, kind of a big name place. And she was like at the same stage in her studies as we were. We were all working on dissertations. And she started, and she was doing her dissertation on Derrida, and she started talking about, all this, what's she doing, and what's the topic and all that. And I thought, well, that was really cool. This will be fun. We can talk about that. Phil's going to be a little bit out to sea because he's more of a Dewey guy, but it'll be fine. Phil's a cool guy. And she just talked, and it was all this it was like just straight jargon. And I didn't even back then. I was rather, assertive when it came to like calling people on stuff. But I was like listening to her, and I was like, I don't think she actually knows what a lot of these terms mean. And then I realized that Derrida was somebody you could do that with quite easily. There's just all this stuff, all this jargon, all this, fun, cool stuff to play with. But you don't know whether all of it is bullshit or not unless you like think your way all the way through it. That's one of the big problems, by the way, with Zizek too. You got to expend so much work figuring out just what is actually being said that some of it may not be actually worthwhile spending the time on. So, and you can say that about you can say that about continental philosophy in general. You can also say that about analytic philosophy in general too. When you figure out what they mean by this ism or this problem that they're labeling, and you're like, this is kind of trivial bullshit. There went a couple hours or a couple days or whatever you devoted to it. You'd kind of like to get some return on investment, you could say, right? When it comes to studying philosophy, you'd kind of like, if you're going to invest the time to read through Descartes' Meditations and really think about it, you'd kind of like to know that you're going to get something out of it. Not necessarily that it'll all be true, but that there'll be a system there that you can understand, or a set of concepts that you can use somewhere, right? And too much of analytic and continental philosophy just doesn't provide that to us. All right, Abdul says, "How's the New Year's resolution going?" I didn't make any New Year's resolutions. I think that. It's better if you don't make resolutions, but instead you do other things, like set goals or things like that. I mean, I've been going to the gym, and that's good. We're eating pretty healthy. I just made almost 6 quarts of good chili today, using some of the stuff that we had on hand, and not getting as much video work done as I'd like, but when is that ever the case that I do, So, all right, let's see what else we got here. There's a lot of stuff. Human Evolution asks, are externals necessary for good life? If does this fly in the face of Stoicism and falsify one of its core concepts? No, it doesn't. As a matter of fact, you want to read Cicero's On the Ends. Clarifies that right up. Read book 3 and then read book 4. Yeah, externals are necessary for the good life. They're not necessary in the same way that the good is necessary for the good life, but managing externals properly is part of virtue for the Stoics. That's one place where the Stoics are different than, say, the Cynics. This is kind of a basic point. And again, if you read Epictetus, you'll get that too. Read beyond there's things in our power, not in our power, and find out what he actually says about the things that aren't in our power, the externals. How we use them is in our power. So yeah, that's a straight one. Happy 63 funny, Plotinus version of evil versus Plato. I don't know that Plato has a version of evil, right? Does he? He discusses the bad at a number of points. And, I would say that where Plato is really following Socrates, he thinks that there is evil, but that human beings engage in evil out of ignorance, amathia. This is something the Stoics took from Socrates as well. Plotinus tends to associate it with this emanation of whatever we want to call it, the one through all these things into ultimately matter. But it's not evil in the same sense as we might. Evil is kind of an equivocal term. We got to be a little bit careful with it. Zeno, what is a good introduction to postmodernism? I've only read the fiction side of postmodernism, not the philosophy side. I don't know that there is a good introduction to it. I would actually be quite leery of anything that pretends to be an introduction to it, because it's a complex concept. And I usually recommend reading Jameson's Postmodernism, the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. But that's a book about this thick, with all sorts of literary illusions that you'll have to like work your way through. I mean, you could read Shorter's Leotard's Postmodern Condition. You might want to like look at the work where the term gets essentially coined. But I don't know. I don't really read a lot of introductory literature except the stuff that people send me for reviews. So, Parobization. What are important works in the philosophy of math? I don't know. It's not. I mean, not really my area. I mean, I read like Cantor and I read Gödel and people like that back when I was studying math, along with philosophy. And of course, back then it was the 90s, so everybody read Gödel, Escher, Bach by Hofstadter, and it's quite good. But I don't know who the important works are in the philosophy of mathematics, quite frankly. I don't really do a lot of that work. Bojadar writes, Sir Roger Scruton passed away 2 weeks ago. I think it was more recent than that, wasn't it? Yeah, people pass away. I'm not somebody who is particularly invested in Scruton. Haven't read a lot of his stuff, and I know about him mostly through the debates about him on Twitter. So I guess if he was like Oakeshott, then he might be somebody interesting for me to read. Because I like Oakeshott's version of understanding what conservatism means, but I don't really know where Scruton was with it. So, it's enough to like stay on top of the people who call themselves conservatives over here, right? Original Bon Jovi. How would an Aristotelian Kant decide between Newman and phenomena? Probably talking about the difference between reality and appearance. Aristotle has that category of certainly when it comes to goods, the apparent good versus the actual good, and I don't think he'd have any real difficulty with that. Kant is asserting that we can't know noumena, we can only think it in a certain way, but we have to assume it's there. I think it's perfectly fine for an Aristotelian to say, yeah, I don't buy it, Kant. I don't go down that path with you. So, yeah. Nate, what do you think is the main difference between continental and analytic philosophy? I don't think there is a main difference. I think there's a body or a bundle of differences. And some of them have to do with style, but I mean, there's so much difference in style in different branches of continental philosophy that you can't just say, oh, well, they're more oriented toward texts or they write in a more convoluted style and analytics are always clear. I mean, if you read enough analytic philosophy, that the whole like clarity thing will go out the window. You'll be like, this shit is not all that clear. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And I think it's better to look at it as like it's almost like, what's the difference between Republicans and conservatives? Well, there's some key issues, but a lot of it has to do with the coalitions that they represent, right? And then they become sort of like part of a discourse. And I think that's become the case with analytic and continental philosophy. I also think too that the analytic continental divide has dominated far too much brain space, because it's essentially like saying, all of philosophy is either Indonesian or Filipino. Well, that's not even all of that area, right? You've also got Thailand and China and Australia, right? And talking about the analytic continental thing, they're both two parochial camps that have a fairly recent provenance that only goes back like a century for analytics. Well, century and a couple decades, and maybe 2 centuries for continentals at best. And there's many other, strains of philosophy out there that are equally interesting and equally important. It just so happens that the American Academy and largely the British Academy is dominated by one of those two. But I think you probably want to get away from that. Dimitri, what's your favorite children's literature? That's a good question. I mean, I don't read a lot of children's literature. I used to read my daughter, when she was quite young. I'd read her Grimm's fairy tales because I quite like those, both in the German and in the English. Um, you know, I mean, there was C.S. Lewis, of course, had the great Narnia stuff, and we did in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction. We did do the Wrinkle in Time series by Madeleine L'Engle, and those are pretty good. Those hold up. I don't know. I don't read a lot of kids' literature these days, so I don't know. Thomas asks, see these mics in a lot of YouTube videos. What sort of price range? I think they're like 100, 150 bucks. But I think we also found it on sale or something like that. So it's, this is what Patreon helps out with, right? We turn that money into new equipment, and stuff eventually breaks down. Cameras break down. Somehow my kids lost one of my spare batteries for the camera. I'm sure they're the ones who probably screwed up my old microphone, knocking it over and stuff like that. But that's just what life is. Kaijin asks, what is law philosophy? Can a lawyer have a doctorate degree to hire his education? Yeah, there are some programs, and there's not a lot of them out there, but there are some programs that are like a joint degree where you get your JD, your doctorate of law, right? And you also get like a PhD in philosophy. I think, if I remember right, I think that Indiana University, Purdue, that joint campus that they have like down in Indy, I think they may have had a degree program like that years back. There's nothing to prevent anybody who's got a degree in one thing from getting a degree in another thing. So like you could have a law degree and decide, man, it'd be useful to have a master's in sociology. So when I'm making claims about, the stuff that I'm litigating, I actually understand like what's happening in this city here, or, policing dynamics or things like that. And you could do that with a philosophy degree, I suppose, or, to really stretch it out, you could have a law degree and you could go get an MFA if you wanted to. Nobody's going to stop you, I don't think, but you probably won't be practicing law full time while you're doing that. So, all right, wee woo, Dr. Sadler, do you have a favorite painter? If so, why? And what's your favorite painting by them? I don't have a favorite painter. I will say I do have a favorite painting, and it hangs here in the Milwaukee Art Museum. It's a massive thing by Anselm Kiefer called Midgard, and you can look it up online. They have it. They show it on the museum website. Pretty cool. I like when I go in there every time that I go, and I haven't been there for a couple of years, even though we only live 1.5 miles from it. We're just so busy. Every time I go in, I try to spend at least 20 to 30 minutes with that painting, and you can very easily because it's massive. It's like see that big window behind me. It's like the size of that massive window. So, all right. Couple of comments here. CSS, do I find any value integrating your shadow like Jung talks about, or do you prefer virtue ethics and suppressing passions? Well, that's a weird dichotomy that you've got there. I mean, as if, Jung is the only person who ever talked about looking at and integrating the parts of yourself that you find shameful or problematic. I mean, virtue ethics, if you read through classic virtue ethics, it's not all about suppressing emotions or passions or stuff like that. You can't suppress them effectively unless you actually understand yourself. So you got to figure out, if we want to be quite blunt, you got to figure out what kind of fuck up you are and how you're fucked up in order to make any progress. Because just, like, let's say you get angry all the time, right? Just saying, "Oh, I'm not going to get angry," like in that Seinfeld episode. Remember where George gets the verse "Serenity now," and by the end he's like saying it through gritted teeth and then blowing up at people. That's not an actual virtue ethics approach. A virtue ethics approach is supposed to provide you with ways of analyzing things, and psychotherapy and depth psychology can be useful for that. I'm not a big buyer in of Jung. I don't really. I like reading him, but I like reading him less about his own stuff and more in his like quite witty discussions of other people's stuff. And I typically don't get much out of Jungians, in part because they tend to be, just sort of regurgitating his stuff. And I mean, even somebody like Lacan, who I do like, who's a Freudian, I probably only buy into a quarter of what he says, and then the rest I'm like, yeah, I think this is bullshit. So, but then there's stuff that's quite useful that we can do. But I wouldn't oppose Jungian integrating the shadow to virtue ethics suppressing emotions. All right. Sad faggot. I'm a Parisian and I dab on peasants. Well, you're probably a dick then. My mom actually did get called a peasant when the last time that she was over in Paris, because she had French Canadian accent, which is closely related to what people used to speak. Sort of older French, just like Appalachian English is. It's not just like it didn't just degenerate. It's preserving older stuff. And yeah, Parisians tend to think that the world revolves around them and that they're the best at everything. And they do get the best opportunities because things are so centralized in France, and everybody else can from the Parisian perspective kind of suck it. Very similar to how New Yorkers view things, and very similar to how the people within the Beltway view things. And I'll tell you, I have zero sympathy for those people and their elitism. So you won't find me agreeing with you on that. Mordak, thoughts on analytic philosophy of religion and natural theology? It might be divisive, but it's super important. Do you plan on talking more about that kind of subject? I find analytic philosophy of religion very boring and usually kind of missing the point and tendentious. Usually analytics are not very well grounded in any sort of like historical tradition. And I think if you're going to try to do anything that's going to do justice to theology, you better actually know a lot of theology and not just like about Molinism or some nonsense like that, or divine hiddenness, whatever the topic du jour is. You need to actually have read your way. If you're going to talk about Christianity, you probably need to have read your way through a lot of the important authors, from the church fathers up to people like Pascal, or you're going to be reinventing a lot of wheels, So I don't find analytic philosophy of religion all that interesting, except for, people like John Wisdom, who of course read other people, outside of analytic philosophy. So, the stuff about language that came out of the Wittgensteinian things is kind of interesting, but they unfortunately generally didn't take into account all the stuff that was going on that had to do with language and signs, going all the way back into the patristics, and in continental philosophy of religion. So, I don't. If you say it's super important, that's great. I don't find it super important myself. Um, will I talk more about that kind of thing? If I do a philosophy of religion sequence or class, probably, but it's not the stuff that I find particularly interesting. All right. Volkolak. Is it possible to combine Stoicism with an absurdist view of the world reality? How fundamental is the belief in a God, God's divine providence, higher plan, and Stoicism? I would say that you can combine modern Stoicism with a non-theistic, non-providential way of looking at things. I don't know that absurdism is the one way to go with that. And it depends on what sort of absurdism you're talking about. If you're talking about, Albert Camus, I think there's prospects there. I think, with most things, when you're combining them, you're going to get to some points where you got to say, listen, either A or B. I can't have both. And I think that'll happen with Stoicism and, Camus' philosophy of the absurd. If you're talking about other people who are, in some ways much more just like random and, they call whatever they do absurdism. Stoicism is about rationality, and so there's a lot of irrationalism in a lot of people's absurdism. And I think that's what turned a lot of people off on it, from like the 60s, 70s onward. Just like, in the 80s, there were all these people who were like, yeah, man, I'm doing Zen. And you'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? You're just doing random shit in a bar, You're calling that Zen? And they'd be like, yeah, I learned a little bit about it. And you'd be like, man, you don't know anything about Buddhism, let alone Zen Buddhism. How often are you meditating? And so I think you could say something similar about Stoicism. Stoicism involves actual practices. Not that you couldn't do that, from a Camusian perspective, but it's a philosophy as a way of life. So yeah. All right. What do I think about Alex Dugan? I haven't actually read him, so from what I've heard, doesn't sound particularly interesting because the neo-traditionalist stuff usually winds up being the same old kind of stuff. I cut my teeth way back in the day when I was doing a lot of work on Blondel and 20th century Catholic thought on, reading Charles Maurras, Action Française, and, sort of spiraling out into all these integral nationalisms. I'm willing to bet that I would find that a lot of what's going to be in Dugan is going to be kind of similar. I don't know though. I haven't actually read them. So I go Waffles. Thoughts on Nicholas of Cusa or Duns Scotus? Both interesting thinkers, both people that I don't get much time to look at. Scotus I haven't looked at for a long time. Nicholas of Cusa, every once in a while I'll open up stuff and take a look around, but I haven't done any serious study of him for a long time either. Both, well worth reading and thinking about, but both people that I haven't made the time to spend any time with recently. And I never read that much of Scotus, it was just to like see what was there. And yeah, it was a long time ago. All right. So yes, I feel like phenomenology is 90% wow, I can just live life, bro. You're probably running into the wrong kind of people. Maybe it's sort of like those people who are saying, I'm doing Zen, man. There's people who say they're doing phenomenology, but don't know anything about classical phenomenology. So I don't know. Zeno asked the meaning of life with a colon. Not sure what that's supposed to be. Maxwell Thompson Kurtz, do you personally think your behavior would change if you didn't believe in God? No, not all that much, in part because my behavior, even though I am a believer in God, is not particularly driven by my belief in God. So, I'm not a particularly devout or following, what I'm supposed to be doing in moral life kind of person in that respect. Anyway, I fall quite short. So in a trivial sense, not believing in God wouldn't do all that much. And I think it's perfect. I think people can have, a pretty good life and pretty good mode of behavior without believing in God. I know plenty of atheists who are much better people, ethically speaking, than many of the Christians self-identified Christians that I know. I mean, we're living in a time when there's a lot of people who, I mean, it's never not been the case though. There's a lot of people who are just hypocrites, right? Or identify with something and it's essentially just group membership, but they don't really believe it because they behave in a different way, right? And it's very glaring right now seeing like people lining up, in their politics with movements and people that are definitely out of sync with whatever values they have, right? So no, I don't think it would make a huge difference. Mickey Osum, what do I think of Shaler and Carol Votia's personalism? Have I read anything about that? What about Edith Stein? As a matter of fact, I really like Max Shaler. I actually, at one point in time, translated one of his works that hadn't been translated. A friend of mine actually published his version of the translation many years later, but he consulted mine when he was going through his. And I think Shaler's really quite good. I think he's just as good as Heidegger, and I think both of them are better than Husserl. Phenomenology, let me say this. Phenomenology, understood as sort of a branch of continental philosophy, produced for itself a lineage and genealogy that was rather exclusionary and worked very well for the people who were kind of in the know, right? Who could claim descendants through it. And it ran like Brentano, who nobody would read, Husserl, who then became very important, Heidegger, Levinas, Merleau-Ponty, Derrida, Marion, blah, 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 right? With Michel Henry in there as well and a few other people that might get like honorary mention. And then Shaler was construed as like, well, he was kind of like a student of Husserl, I think, or stuff like that, which is complete bullshit, Shaler was doing his own thing. Phenomenology was not something like owned by Husserl, right? It was a thing that was going on across the board. Maurice Blondel was doing phenomenology. He just called it the philosophy of immanence. Bergson was doing phenomenology. He called it the attention to the immediate data of life. Gabriel Marcel was doing phenomenology early on as well. And so Shaler is really one of the big figures in early phenomenology. And he's doing a phenomenology that's centered around value. So I think that his work is particularly good. I also think Edith Stein is quite good too, although she's more limited than Shaler is. And Votia, who later becomes John Paul II. He's quite good. I've read the translation of The Acting Person. People say that it's not a very good translation. I don't know because I don't read Polish, right? But that whole like Lublin Thomism thing was kind of a cool thing. And I think that there's all sorts of really interesting figures in the phenomenological movement that are highly underrated. In philosophy of religion, Jean Ehring, for example, spelled like herring, right? But pronounced Ehring. And Somebody I'll mention who was a student of Husserl that some people might find interesting, Roman Ingarden. His work is really friggin' boring, though. But you can say the same thing about Husserl's analyses as well. And then, from Heidegger, we get this whole, sort of hermeneutic thing with Gadamer. There's also Ricoeur doing stuff on phenomenology in France, who, by the way, was also involved in the Christian philosophy debate. So there's all these interesting figures, and so many of them have unfortunately been ignored and sidelined because they didn't fit into a neat narrative that the people who teach continental philosophy were invested in. So, Riverside Library, did you ever do psychedelics? If so, what and how much? I never did any psychedelics as such, like acid or mushrooms or that sort of thing. As a matter of fact, when it comes to drugs, I haven't done much at all. I preferred to drink. I enjoyed alcohol much more than anything else that I tried. Smoked some pot when I was in graduate school, but I didn't like potheads because they were content to sit around and do nothing all day and just laugh at stuff, and I found that really quite boring. And the only other things that I ever tried, and I tried them while, I was drunk and smoking marijuana, would be ecstasy and PCP. And the ecstasy I tried just once. I had this German girlfriend who was, kind of she was a heavy pothead. She was such a great pothead that she would roll these gigantic joints that would take like 5 papers and have a filter at the end and have like hash in the middle. And people would give her stuff just to have her roll joints. And so she was also into all sorts of other things. She was like a big techno person at the time too. So, she had us each doing ecstasy, but I don't know if it was any good because, I was drunk at the time and we were smoking pot. And then I had a cousin who was selling pot who laced the pot that he had us smoke that time. And as a matter of fact, that girlfriend was there too. And he laced it with PCP. And I did not like that. Holy crap. I would never do that again. So yeah, there we go. I'm not a big believer in the like opening the doors of consciousness kind of thing. I think that a lot of that's really just bullshit. And I think that, if you can use it for that sort of thing, it's sort of like, what the spiritual masters were telling Huxley when he was writing about that sort of stuff. They're like, you should do meditation instead. But people like that sort of thing. I think they see it as there's a sort of mystique involved with psychedelics. Just never been attracted to that sort of thing. Let's see here. The Neo-Epicurean, thanks for the videos. I've watched a lot. I just wrote an essay on acrasia. I watched your weakness of will video many times. Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's something really quite important. Zeno, I don't trust priests. Most of them get caught touching kids. So much for a higher morality. Well, that's stupid bullshit, right? Most of them don't get caught touching kids. The rate of sexual abuse among Catholic priests is no higher than it is for social workers, police officers, ministers of Pentecostal churches, rabbis, pick whatever you like. Anybody who's got unsupervised contact with kids, there's a tendency for there to be problems, and it doesn't have anything to do with religion in particular. That's just a noxious stereotype that people have. There's a lot of priests that I don't trust because I think they're not very good priests. Same thing with bishops. I think the bishops are a particularly sorry lot at this point in time, but you can say similarly of CEOs, can't you? So, All right. Leah asked, oops, just jumped. There was a question here about Sextus Empiricus. There's a lot of questions here. On my side, I see like, only a portion of what's being asked until it suddenly skips down. All right. Man, I'm scrolling up a lot and still, here we go. Do I have any plans on making videos on Sextus Empiricus? Yeah, actually, I would like to do that. It's a question of finding the time. That would probably have to happen in the summer and the fall because right now I'm shooting a lot of core concept videos for the classes that I'm currently teaching, and so there's a lot of content I need to crank out. But yeah, that is a big gap. I'd also like to shoot some stuff on the Cynics, more stuff on the Epicureans, like on Lucretius. So, all right. Ben asks, do I think it's worthwhile for someone to go and study philosophy at university at 30 if they want a career afterwards? Depends on what kind of career. Do you want to try to teach philosophy as a full-time employed professor? Those jobs are fewer and fewer every year, and they tend to get taken up by the people coming from the elite universities. So people who are coming from anything less than the elite are having an incredibly hard time finding full-time work. And I mean, you could adjunct, but adjuncting is only good if you've got another thing on the side. So like, I adjunct, but I've got my business. So that, I'm not making a ton of money teaching at Marquette or Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, and I'm not getting any benefits from them. As a matter of fact, we're on the Affordable Care Act marketplaces because we're self-employed. But I have my business, so if that's your sort of thing that you plan to do, that's okay. And you can do a lot of things with a philosophy degree that aren't being a philosophy professor. So you could go into all sorts of fields, some of which you might train for. Like, let's say you wanted to be a medical ethicist and work in a hospital. That's something you'd specialize in during your studies. So there are quite a few things that you can do with a degree. So yeah. Let's see here. Alexander says, with my course in Hegel, he could understand him. I'm glad it helped you then. All right. The Pink Arab. What do I think of veganism? So I think that veganism as on the whole is a good thing. I think that a lot of vegans are assholes, and I can't stand spending time with them because they're insufferable. But that doesn't really have to do that much with veganism itself, right? I think it's a good thing to I think that the push to like, we got to be completely vegan, you can't even wear leather or something like that. Man, the cow's dead already. You're not going to like put the hide back on the cow by not wearing a leather jacket. I think though we can reduce our use of animal products and, especially dairy, and we can, certainly eat less meat. And if we're going to, things can be ethically farmed, as we say in sort of talking about ethical farming. The cow only has one bad day, right? And factory farming is horrific, right? So there's certainly things to be said for it. Being vegan doesn't mean that you're not killing any animal life. I mean, Peter Singer pointed this out. He, when he came to the Culinary Institute of America, people were asking him about agriculture, and he was like, "Well, when you're looking at agriculture, you are still killing things, living things, not just plants, but the shrews and mice in the soil and worms and stuff like that." And so, I think it's important to be realistic about it rather than doctrinaire about it. All right. Joel Settle, thoughts on Hegel's analysis of Stoicism and the phenomenology. I don't think Hegel got Stoicism right. I think Hegel got a certain caricature of Stoicism right, that people sometimes buy into, even people today claiming to be Stoics, but I don't think that for the most part he got it right. I've got a piece on that over in the Half Hour Hegel blog that you could take a look at. He has a little bit more analysis of it in his History of Philosophy. Yeah. Oh, here's an interesting question. Lino Tex, are you working on some magnus opus yourself as a philosopher? Nope. Just trying to stay afloat, keep up with the work commitments that I've made, to my students, to my clients, to the Modern Stoicism organization as editor of Stoicism Today, to the people bringing me in for talks and stuff like that. Maybe there'll be a magnum opus someday, but I don't know. I'm that's not something that really matters that much to me. I'm happy doing the kind of stuff that I do. I don't know that we need another magnum opus added to the lot. I'm trying to read other people's magna op. What is the plural? Well. Marcos, what do you think is better, me or Aristotle? Well, probably Aristotle, right? I know him. So, Breezy Free, thoughts on the split between Heidegger and Hegel regarding Kant? I don't know what the split between Heidegger and Hegel would be. They're separated from each other by more than a century. So, all right. Joseph Fowler, what view do you take on how Descartes' cogito has reached intuition or inference? I mean, what does Descartes have to say on that? He doesn't think it's a intuition, which is a really vague term anyway. He reasons his way to the cogito, so I guess you'd say it's inference, wouldn't you? What else could it be? Bruce is here. Thanks, Bruce. Let's see what else we got here. Riverside Library. Oh, he's talking with Zeno of Elea, so I'm going to skip over that. I'm going to get rid of this stuff. All right. Bruno says, if philosophy is the product of reason, where truth is found in logic, so I'll just stop you right there. That's not the case, right? Why is it there are so many different and conflicting schools of thought? So, I mean, you started with a non-starter, where truth is found in logic. Truth is found in all sorts of modes. It's not just found in logic, so that probably won't go anywhere. Why are there different and conflicting schools of thought? Because reality is complicated, and the human being is complicated, and so there's many different ways of understanding things, and that's the reality that we have to work with in terms of philosophy. So, Kanal, have I read Erod Kimmy's book? I don't even know who Erod Kimmy is. So, Diogenes asks, what do I think of Heidegger's concept of the nothing and its uncovering in anxiety? So I think Heidegger's understanding of the nothing, it's not a concept as such, but because it's not that kind of thing, right? The nothing, he plays with this a lot. The nothing separates the nothing from being, et cetera, et cetera. Heidegger's idea of it is not something radically new, but some of the things that he's doing with it in terms of human freedom are kind of new. Freedom extends itself out into the nothing and thereby adds something new to being, which is not a nothing, but the nothing is a condition for that. And how is it revealed in anxiety or angst, anguish, it's also translated as. He talks about a receding of beings, and everything he's doing in like, what is metaphysics, or in his discussions of this in Being and Time, has to be through metaphorical language. But I think we can relate to it, and I think it's a really good analysis. I don't think that anxiety is the only truly revelatory mood the way Heidegger made it out to be. Somebody else who says that, who's of course got a much greater, output and pedigree than me, is Adrian Pepperzak, who was at, I think he's retired now. He was at Loyola. He's got some great books discussing these sorts of things that he wrote in the early 2000s. He was a phenomenologist, worked on Levinas, worked on Heidegger, worked on Hegel. I think he actually studied under Ricoeur, if I remember right, too. And I tend to think that sorrow and joy and awe can be as revelatory of being as can anxiety. I don't think that anger can. Anger can be revelatory of a lot, but I don't think it can be revelatory of being in the same way. Here's a question by Retro Gamer. When do I think psychological analysis or psyche analysis and typology will integrate into moralist and ethical metaphysical projects? I would say that it'll do that when we have people who are trained in sort of like bridging fields, or like translation problems. You got to have people who understand both and think that they're both important, and then they bring them together. So the other thing that's a factor. There has to be time. There has to be institutional space. There has to be some sort of not necessarily rewards, but something that allows that activity to be sustained. That's sort of a general point about how do you bring together, something from column A and something from column Q. How do you do that generally? So I think, there are people bringing things together in interesting ways, but I don't know with those in particular. All right. So I'm going to have to get going pretty soon and actually get on with my work, but I'm going to answer just a few more questions. So I won't get to a lot of these, but here's one I should answer. CS, have you read any big fiction tomes like James Joyce Ulysses or David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest? Have you discerned what they're trying to get at? I don't bother with those sorts of things, the high literature. I mean, I do like some high literature, but I don't like James. And people talked so much how great Ulysses was, and I read a bit of it, and I was like, I'm not going to waste my time on this crap. This is self-indulgent stuff that just happens to have a fanboy base that keeps saying it's so wonderful. Never even cracked open Infinite Jest. There's nothing that I've heard about it that makes me think it's worth my time. That said, I have spent time on big fiction tomes. They're just not those sorts of things. There are other tomes instead. I'm not into the high modernist literature, I have to say. All right. Let's see here. Oh, here's a good question from Gordon Ramsay. Have I dabbled in panpsychism? No, it's something that I'm seeing getting talked about a lot on Twitter, though. And so that's kind of interesting. I haven't devoted any time to it or any study. So there's not much for me to say. Let me see what else I can quickly answer before we get to the 1 hour mark. Here's an interesting one. This is a more personal question, so I think this is good to go out on. CS, when you were younger, did you imagine yourself having a kid, or did it just kind of happen and you were okay with it? So, I had 3 kids. One miscarried, and that was with somebody who I was with as a graduate student. She was a librarian at Southern Illinois University, and we got involved. And in some respects, we were very compatible. In other respects, we weren't a good match. But we were in love with each other. She got pregnant, and I think she was probably about 4 months along when things we'd had some tensions, and she ended up miscarrying, and neither one of us handled it very well, and we broke up. But that would have been my first kid, and that was unplanned. And but I was at that time I would have been about 27, so I was I was happy that that was what was going on. And then um, I got married after my mom died, my adopted mother, and I had to handle her estate. And the person who I was involved with at the time, um, who turned out to be quite different than I thought. I was not all that happy with her, but I'd gotten to the point where I was turning. I was in my going into my 30s, and I thought, well, you've had a lot of pretty wild affairs. Maybe it's time to like settle down and all of that, and take on some adult responsibilities. You're going to be graduating, fairly soon after you get your dissertation finished. And I thought that getting married would change things, but we were neither one of us was in a very good state to be married. But we ended up having kids, and we divorced afterwards. And my kids, who are now, my one is 17 and the other is 12. um, they're good things that came out of that relationship. It's been difficult to parent at a distance, and my ex made it as difficult as possible for quite a while. Um, but you do what you can, and my relationship with my kids has grown and changed. And it's not as if my relationship with them is just this single thing. It's also connected to my relationship and their relationship with my wife, Andy, who or her pets, who have become my pets as well, or the people that we're involved with. And neither kid was planned in the sense of like, oh, now it's time to have kids, exactly. But I was open to it, and I was happy to have kids. Some people don't really want to be parents. I did, and I do. Um, and once you have kids, if you take parenting seriously, your life will never be the same, because you have these responsibilities now that you bear towards other developing people. And you get to see them going through some of the same crap that you yourself went through. you know uh, for example, Maddie will do the same sort of like making noises just to make noise, out of a sort of, like not even really thinking about it, that I used to do as a kid, that drove my mom and dad nuts. And now it drives me nuts, and I have to remind myself that that came from me, just as much as some of the things that I've got from my own dad, my bio dad, are part of my temperament. And it's been interesting too, connecting up with my biological father and my siblings, and finding out not only how much we have in common, but also my kids have in common with them too. So to answer the question, I didn't do a lot of imagining of myself having a kid. Once I did have kids, I imagined things like I was gonna, I tried to teach Catherine French, and it just never stuck. We were gonna talk French at home, like my mom used to do with me, and um, that just didn't happen. And we were, you imagine all these things you're gonna do with them, and then they're not into it. They're and it makes sense because they're not you. They're their own person who's developing in the way that they do. But once you are a parent, if you are a good parent, or even if you're, I won't even say I'm a good parent. I'm somebody who struggles to parent in the way that I should and takes it seriously. Your life is now quite different. The things that you do have an impact. Part of the reason why I know I'm going way over time. I'm gonna have to get to work pretty soon. But part of why I'm devoted to working out is I want to be able to spend another 40 years with my kids. I don't want them to have the experience that I had of losing my dad, my adopted father, when he was 36 and I was 11, and losing my adopted mother when I was 29 and she was 53. I want to be there for all the big things, and I want to be able to give them the advice that I couldn't get, and help them out in ways that my mom tried to, but didn't always succeed in. So that's I guess a good place to end on. I've done my share in like making sure that we maintain the population. 2 kids who've survived so far. I will say one more thing too. Once you have kids, this goes to thinking about stoicism and what's in your control and what's not in your control. You have made yourself so much more vulnerable to the world by having kids and caring about them than you were before. But you can say similar things too about loving somebody in a relationship. Now you've got other people that can get hurt, can be bullied, can encounter prejudice or discrimination, can make stupid decisions of their own, and you will be affected by it. And there's only so much that you can actually do to make it better or to stave off those things, but you're in it. So having children roots you in the world in a very new way. So on that, I'm going to end. I didn't get to everybody's questions and comments, but I never do. So thanks for all of your questions, comments. Hope the mic sounds good. And going to leave off here.